he's looking like the top player that he once was, once again. And that's great news for him, and great news for Bayern, especially if they can keep him. For him financially, it's a massive deal. But the whole thing about being back and actually being able to show what you can do right away is also of concern when we talked about the next guy, right? And that's Harry Kane. We all know the story of Harry Kane and his injury concerns. Whenever he does come back from an injury, it always takes him quite some time to find his full fitness again. I had a long conversation about that with Sepp Stafford-Bloor, right, who covered Kane, not just at Bayern, but previously at Tottenham Hotspurs. And, he made this comment to me once, like that, Kane might be on the field after an injury, but in reality, he's not necessarily right away at full fitness. And we've seen this with England, we've seen this with Tottenham, with many times where Kane is back on the field, but he's just not there. And I think that's an interesting wrinkle for this match, because he will have to be at his very best. Bayern Munich have struggled to score against big teams. They have gotten results regardless because their defense has been much improved, right? But, how many games have they won this year just by 1-0? And because Jamal Musiala has discovered this eerie form of scoring headers. And I think it has to be more than Jamal Musiala in this match. We saw it against Mainz. When Jamal Musiala doesn't pop up with a goal, then this Bayern team really struggled, right? And so, it needs more than one guy scoring goals, because this has been one big part of the story, and you highlighted it in your article. We spoke about it on the podcast. There isn't much scoring in this team right now. There's Kane, there's Musiala, and then there's a bunch of nothing for, a long time.
Yeah, it's going to be really, really interesting to see how Kane does in this game, if he does come back from injury, because he's having such a kind of stop-start season, and I feel like it's only something that we can talk about in the safety of this podcast, where the people obviously listening are, very passionate Bundesliga fans who watch every game and appreciate the nuances of the players from week to week, because I've tried to have this conversation with people at work about how I've not actually been particularly impressed by Harry Kane this season, and they look at me like I have three heads, because they just see a guy who scored 20 goals in 19 games, who's breaking the record for the quickest amount of time to 50 goals in the Bundesliga, more goals than Erling Haaland, blah 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 blah. And I have to I try to point out the fact that, there's still some things that disappoint and some things that frustrate Bayern fans, and it just kind of falls on deaf ears. So I'll try and do it here. And,
here's what you need to do, Stefan. You just need to say he plays like he does for England.
Well,
it's totally comparable. His goal scoring record for England is fantastic too, because he will have these games where he scores 5 against Andorra.
Yeah, and there's a few Andorras in the Bundesliga, I guess, this season, called Holstein Kiel. But that's literally. I mean, I've literally have his record again in the Bundesliga, and I can hopefully read it out, and our listeners will see a theme here. So, opening game against Wolfsburg, he doesn't score. He gets 2 assists, so fair enough. Scores against Freiburg, scores 3 against Holstein Kiel, scores against Werder Bremen. No goals against Leverkusen. No goals against Frankfurt. 3 against Stuttgart. 1 against Bochum, 2 against Union Berlin, no goals against St. Pauli, 3 against Augsburg, no goals against Dortmund. So in 12 games this season, he's scored 14 goals. Sorry, in 12 games this season, in 14 goals he's scored in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games. And he hasn't scored a single goal against Dortmund. Admittedly, he only played 33 minutes against Dortmund. No goals against Dortmund, no goals against Leverkusen, no goals against Frankfurt. And then, of course, you can go to the Champions League. No goals against PSG, no goals against Benfica, no goals against Aston Villa. And he scored he did score against Barcelona, but
they lost.
They lost. And on that night, we spent a good amount of time talking about how ineffective he was in that match. So I'm really intrigued to see, if he's fully fit going into this game and whether he starts. And if he isn't, or if he is fully fit and he's ready to start, if he's ready to kind of score a goal in a big important game, because we haven't really seen it from him yet this season. And I know he scored a hat-trick against Stuttgart, and they're technically a top 4 side or whatever, but I'm not really willing to count them just because they've obviously had a very difficult start to the season. Their team that's obviously imploded, and they're only just kind of getting back on their feet now. So I wouldn't really count them at this moment in time among the best teams in Germany, if you'll allow me to put it that way, to frame it that way. And I think it's just something that Bayern fans are still waiting for him to do. I think in games where teams take the game to Bayern, he can look isolated. And when he doesn't have that service constantly being streamed to him in the box, he becomes pretty ineffective. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if he's fit and whether he can actually dictate one of these games.
Well, so listening to you here, let me break down to you what Harry Kane is. He's a striker who scores every second game, right? And not against big teams, right? I mean, this sums it up. And I do think, and I want to contextualize this a little bit because I don't want to sound flippant and anti-Harry Kane and all that kind of thing. I think a big part of that story is that I don't think he's actually fully fit. And I mean, yes, he's not fully fit right now because he's coming back from injury, but I think he wasn't fully fit before that either. And I think we've seen it at the Euros. I think remember that injury he picked up against Real Madrid? And that has bothered him ever since. And he carried a lower back injury into that game as well, right? I think that's still there. And that's why we see him play the way he's playing. And why he has these almost ketchup bottle-like explosions, against these lower teams that just seem to collapse. The Augsburg game is a great example. He scores 2 times from the spot and then gets a third. That Augsburg just utterly collapsed after that penalty. And, I would actually go as far and say without that penalty, Kane probably doesn't score in that match. And, I think I think he's carrying something, and I think he's been carrying something for a while. And I can't prove it. I'm not a doctor. I'm not part of Bayern Munich's athletic staff. I can only look at the player and the way he moves on the field, and there is a distinct difference between the Harry Kane that we saw early on for Bayern Munich last year and the one we saw this year. It's night and day. He just doesn't move right for me, and he didn't move right for England during the Euros either. And I think that is a big part of the story. So he might be back, but I don't think he's fit. And I think that fitness concern, and this is the great thing, and I think this is why he was so smart moving to the Bundesliga, because he's going to get a break, which is something he's never gotten really before he played in England, right? I think whatever that break might actually be key for him to get a proper rest and reset for 2025.
Question is then, does Kompany have the courage to drop him for this game?
You can't. You have to play.
Well, that's the thing though, because if he's only half fit and he's not ready to play, and he struggles to, excuse me, have an impact in these games to begin with, but even when he is fit and in form, is Kompany actually better going with a system where you have, a Jamal Musiala or a Leroy Sané or a Serge Gnabry, as a
but
kind
these
of
guys
false
haven't
number
scored
9.
either. They haven't scored either, right?
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just kind of plucking numbers out of thin air here, but because I think that would almost be quite interesting. I think that would completely disembobulate or whatever, like Leipzig's approach to the game, because I think they're expecting Harry Kane start and they're probably working their tactics around that. But all of a sudden, if Bayern go out, play a different system, and it's Musiala up front as a false 9, then that changes things entirely. And in a way, it might actually suit Bayern better. But
yeah,
that's maybe a very spicy take.
No, I think it's actually not a spicy take at all. I think the issue with this take is that I don't think Vincent Kompany is in a position yet at Bayern Munich where he can make that sort of decision. I think he doesn't play Harry Kane and Bayern Munich lose this game. The day before the last match day before the Christmas break, boy, the media in Munich would tear him apart. The controversy around that would be so big. I don't think he would be able to stomach it yet. I don't think he's in the position politically to do it. If he plays Harry Kane and they lose, then I think it'd still be bad, but it wouldn't be quite as bad. You know what I mean? Like, it's just the optics would be different. But the issue too that I personally have is they have put themselves into this situation now where they have two guys that score in key moments, and that's Jamal Musiala and, well, I guess Harry Kane, even though we just outlined that he doesn't really score in key moments. And so you can't just play with Jamal. He's tried with Thomas Müller against Mainz, and playing Musiala and Müller as the two strikers up front, and it was an utter disaster. I actually don't think that playing Musiala as a striker works. He needs to play off someone, right? He needs to be deeper in the field to create these situations where he can go one-on-one with several defenders and make this room and space. And when he's with Müller on the field, he gets almost nullified in a way. And so it's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because like politically you can't play Harry Kane, but if Harry Kane isn't fully fit, there's almost no point playing him either. So it's almost like a situation where you can only lose. And the only way for this not to become an issue is for Bayern to go out and beat Leipzig.
Yeah, well,
it's
exactly.
It's as simple as that.
Which I think they probably have got to do, don't they?
Yeah, of course. Bayern will have to, I think for this to be a Merry Christmas, Bayern have to beat Leipzig.
Sorry, just had another coughing fit there. Maybe laughing at something there. Yeah, I think it's a must-win game for Bayern, which means maybe Harry Kane has to start, which in turn maybe makes it difficult for him to win the game, but that's football, I suppose.